Thank you very much, Jonathan. Indeed, very, very interesting conclusions. I would like to invite also Martin, if you have some perhaps remarks on the presentation by Jonathan and the other way around. As a start, I'd like to point where we are also receiving questions from the audience and trying to keep a little bit the time because we are a little bit beyond. I would like to remark a couple of points. One is that do not give the impression that a building renovation passport is by itself not useful. We stress very much that its impact is related to other measures such as those presented today, because in practice the market in buildings in particular is, as we stressed from the start, a very complex situation. So in order to trigger renovations, there are a lot of things that need to happen. There are financial aspects, there are time aspects, there are information aspects, and all of these are not aspects that can simply be covered by just one measure. If there was such a measure, I believe most of us would have seen deep renovations to a much greater extent in Europe long ago. However, this does not mean that such tools by themselves cannot have a substantial impact. So my question both to Martin and to Jonathan would be, let's assume that while we are waiting for the Commission and for the Member States and for the broader European communities to take initiatives in these directions, are there perhaps some key points that could be pushed forward already, either by agencies or by citizens or by the market itself, and perhaps have we already seen such examples?
Well, maybe I can add a few points to that question. On the one hand, I think we have to be aware that the introduction of a roadmap is a process, so it does need some time, and that means depending on the circumstances in each country. I mean, we've seen in our pilot countries within iBRoad, and Peter will talk next week about that, very practical issues like how do you calculate the buildings? Is it demand or real use based? Is it which tools can be used? How is the interface between the tools and the iBRoad assistant? So these kind of very practical questions. You need to find the auditors who are available and who are ready to be trained. I mean, either a country has not so many auditors, or there is such a high demand for renovation, a situation which we have right now. I mean, the renovation rate is not sufficient, but still we have a lack of skilled planners, architects, and energy auditors. So it really is a process, and you need to prepare it. So in case you want to do something like that, it's a very good idea to start now and to develop the things. Also, the roadmap should be something that is attractive and handy, or very and useful. And so, in order to make that happen, for instance, in Germany, we had a process for the software suppliers of the energy audit software, which took about a year to prepare them to be able to use it or to implement that within their software. So there is so the iBRoad assistant, which we developed separately here in iBRoad, is integrated into the software. So that makes it much easier to use and to prepare such a roadmap, because it's part of the package software an energy auditor buys anyway. And what we can see is that in Germany, the share of energy audits for residential buildings that go the direction of a building roadmap instead of a 150-page, consultancy report is actually increasing now quite dynamically, but it took some time before the market took it up. So what I'm saying is, yes, it's a good idea to start it now because it does need preparation.
Excellent. Jonathan, perhaps a comment on this?
No, I fully agree, and I don't really have anything to add there.
Okay, very good. Okay, one additional question before we probably need to close the webinar due to time. Are there already perhaps some examples of minimum renovation requirements and incentives to implement the renovation from the presented regulatory examples? Martin, you mentioned the dangers of regulation in terms of making things too obligatory and then perhaps getting some results that are just to cover the regulation. But are there some specific examples, let's say, good practices in this regard, perhaps, that are worth mentioning?
Well, I think we have to distinguish here. I mean, there are many examples for minimum requirements for in the building code for existing buildings. We actually collected them recently for the next concerted action. So there are many examples, for instance, minimum U values when you renovate anyway, etc. But this is on the level of technical components. On the other hand, there are the overall renovation obligations. Some countries are now in the process of introducing these, like buildings can only be renovated when they have an efficiency class F, for instance. A couple of countries are introducing these kind of renovation requirements. We did not find, except for the two examples I mentioned, the one in the States and the one in Germany, where we are actually discussing a kind of, required audits at certain trigger points. So I'm not aware, at least, of a measure where a building roadmap is made mandatory in certain occasions. And maybe there is a fourth way to include that into the regulation. I think what is really important to have this long-term target somewhere in the building code, so that people know that within the next 2 or 3 decades, it will be necessary to bring these buildings to a decarbonized status quo. Because when we have this knowledge, then every renovation step will be influenced by this long-term target, because you have to consider whether it's compatible. So it doesn't need to be that the actual roadmap is part of the building code, but the philosophy of the roadmap, this long-term thinking and the avoiding lock-ins, this can be implemented as a requirement as well.
Yes, that's an excellent example, and one can think a little bit of the evolution of the car market, where already now we know that apart from the measures that have already been taken, we know that in 10 years from now, for example, diesel cars might be altogether banned in many cities. So in this respect, a car owner already knows where they're heading. Of course, we know that the building market is much more complex, but nevertheless, it's I think this example that is an very interesting point.
Maybe I can add one last sentence on that. Actually, that was the beginning of the thinking of the renovation roadmap. We had a discussion in Berlin in the year 2009. The state of Berlin, not Berlin as a capital of Germany, the state of Berlin was discussing whether to introduce, they called that a long-term step curve, so a kind of requirement to bring the building in steps on certain minimum requirements. And this was the beginning of the discussion of this long-term thinking. So actually, the roadmap was, kind of the consultancy part of this discussion.
Okay, very interesting. Okay, thanks to everyone who has contributed. Thanks to all the attendees for bearing with us until now. As I said from the start, the webinar has been recorded and will be made available along with PDFs from the presentations of today. We look forward to seeing you in the next webinar on the 27th of February and other events upcoming. Please do get in touch with us. Do subscribe to iBRoad's news alert to receive our news. And hopefully we will see you also at our physical conference in May. So thanks again, and we'll close the webinar now. If there are any questions that we might have missed somehow and not been able to cover, please do send them by email, and we'll follow up with them when publishing the information on the webinar. Thank you very much.